So before I do the introduction, I want to provide a little bit of a background on the impetus for including a panel on equity, diversity, and inclusion today. So as Emma mentioned this morning, CAPS has been working on EDI issues because doing so advances CAPS's mandate of improving the lives, training, and work experiences of all postdocs. And over the past year, CAPS has worked on a number of EDI issues. For example, early in 2019, CAPS provided feedback to the Tri-Council consultation on a Made in Canada Athena SWAN model. And SWAN, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is the acronym for Scientific Women's Academic Network. Athena SWAN was launched in the UK in 2005, and it's an internationally recognized initiative that celebrates higher education institutions that have implemented practices to advance EDI and help drive deeper cultural change in STEM. Athena SWAN models have been adopted outside of the UK, and some versions have increased the scope of underrepresented groups to include persons with disabilities and racialized populations, and focused on all areas of the research ecosystem. Through the creation of a Made in Canada Athena SWAN, the Government of Canada is aiming to improve EDI in Canadian higher education institutions, and CAPS was a part of this consultation. CAPS has also added new EDI-focused questions to its 2019 survey of Canadian postdocs. So be sure to complete the survey and have your postdoc colleagues complete it so we can develop a fuller picture of postdoc-specific EDI issues. Now turning to our panelists. So we're very pleased to have one of Canada's strongest advocates for EDI as our speaker in this panel. Dr. Imogen R. Coe is a cell biologist. She was founding dean at the Faculty of Science from 2012 to 2018. Dr. Coe is a professor of chemistry and biology at Ryerson and an affiliate scientist at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. Dr. Coe is internationally recognized as a Canadian thought leader in the area of equity, diversity, and inclusion in science, technology, engineering, and math, or STEM. She's advised academia, government, and industry. She's very much in demand as a speaker and panelist and has received numerous awards for her advocacy work. And she's joining us virtually from Toronto with her talk, Embracing Dimensions, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in Canadian Research Culture.
Research. Okay. And are there other people on the panel?
Yeah. No, you are our keynote.
Oh, I am the panel. Okay.
You are the panel.
Okay. I'm not quite sure why I'm not being able to. I think you're going to get my speaker notes. I'm sorry about that.
Oh, it's fine.
I've actually got two screens, and it looks good on the other screen and not on this screen. Which is ah, there we go. Is that better?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Well, I'm really sorry I can't be there with you in Halifax. It's one of my favorite cities, but I'm delighted to be with you virtually on this platform. So I hope there's lots of good networking and information exchange going on. I realized that I did not put in my slides, as I usually do, an acknowledgement of where I do my work. Usually my second slide is the land acknowledgement for Ryerson University, and I think it's really important when you're talking about equity, diversity, and inclusion to acknowledge that the land where we're doing our work has been inhabited by people for many tens of thousands of years, and to acknowledge that. Ryerson is in what's known as the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas, and we come into that treaty not always invited. Land has been taken, but we all come here now under this Dish with One Spoon treaty in the spirit of peace, reconciliation, and friendship and respect, mutual respect. So I just want to acknowledge that that's a really important part, the set of principles that kind of frames the work that we do. So when I was putting this, well, I should also finish by saying the land acknowledgements are calls to action. They are not ceremonial, they are calls to action that drive us to affect change and make change. And so one of my responses to that call of action is to always try and recognize contributions that Indigenous scholars have made in various aspects of many disciplines across all the disciplines in academia, and I try to find opportunities to promote and support and give platforms to Indigenous scholars where possible. Use my privilege to elevate other people, and so that's that's the call to action. And we need to do that because human capital is the most important resource that developed countries has. And this is just a comment from the former president of the World Bank, noting that it is human capital that will account for growth in countries, in developed countries in the future. Now, we hear a lot in Canada about oil, about mining, about forestry. We are very much seen as a resource dependent economy in terms of our natural resources. And that is true, but it is human capital, human intellect that's going to be really important for growth in the future. And we are a small population in competing on a global level with very big countries, India, China, the US. And so we have to leverage every ounce of human intellectual capital that we can leverage in order to have the quality of life that we enjoy and the standard of living. And that means embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think sometimes this is a little bit overlooked when we're talking about values around EDI. There's actually economic value around embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And it benefits all of us. It's greater sustainability, there's improved stability, better governance, a whole variety of good things that come out of leveraging human capital. And I think it's really important, and I'm continually reminding the system that postdoctoral researchers represent some of the most highly trained human capital. They are the human intellect that needs to be leveraged. And, you know, I give advice to postdocs, and anybody is free to contact me for any advice at any time. I do a lot of mentoring online, and I'm happy to help anybody with job applications, with if you're going for an interview in academia, writing your first grant, I am happy to help anybody. But you are very, very highly skilled, and make sure you capture all your skills in things like CVs, applications, and interviews, because sometimes I find postdocs, and particularly postdocs from marginalized groups, that could be women in science, that could be people of color, people with disabilities, often undersell themselves and don't always put down all of the skills that they actually have acquired during this extensive period of training. And there's a link here for some really good resources, which interestingly, none of these resources are Canadian, because other countries are ahead of us in terms of sort of developing a more diverse workforce and highly qualified trainees. But you are extremely important and drive a lot of the research enterprise. And the postdoctoral research population doesn't really reflect Canada on humanity in general. And obviously my area of skill, my experience and my acquired expertise is mostly around the STEM disciplines. So these are data from science and engineering, which are gender binary. They don't tell us anything about other human characteristics. We're very data poor in Canada, but they do tell us that the pipeline or the pathway is very unidimensional. It does not reflect what Canada looks like or what humanity looks like in general, at least in the STEM disciplines, and certainly in other disciplines we see an underrepresentation of people of color, Indigenous, members of the LGBTQ community. So we are missing talent all the way along, and that's a problem. We don't want to be missing talent. We want to be accessing all the talent. For those interested in pursuing careers in academia, we also know that the demographics are shifting, and that can add challenges to the availability of academic positions if that's what you want. And I don't think by any stretch of the imagination that is, you know, that is a destination. I have long since banned the term alternate careers from my vocabulary, and I call anybody out who uses it around me. There's no such thing. In fact, an academic career is the outlier. But you can see, if you look at the change in demographics, that 40 years ago, or almost 50 years ago, you know, who had a position as an academic a faculty member, and how old those people were has really, really shifted. Again, I think, you know, that are we leveraging all the talent available to us in more recently trained HQP? I think these are some uncomfortable questions that the Canadian academic sector needs to be asking itself. And Canadian academia is a little bit slow to get with the program, I would say, compared to business and industry, who have long since, including in Canada, recognized that they're going to do better if they leverage their diversity and inclusion opportunities. They're going to make more money. They're going to get better outcomes. They're going to be more competitive. And there's a ton of data now available. There's no doubt that this is a reality. It's the question is, how do you actually integrate the principles of equity, diversity, and inclusion into your particular workforce or your workplace, how you do that. So that's what sort of industry and business are struggling with. And there are some real leaders out there in terms of actually affecting change, and often they're being led by people that you might not expect. Old straight middle-class white men have become extremely effective leaders in integrating D&I. D&I is how it's referred to in some places. EDI is what we tend to use in academia. So academia traditionally is slow to change. I grew up in Cambridge in the UK, and Cambridge University has been around for, you know, almost 1,000 years. Academia is very resistant to change. It's also very resilient. So, you know, it's a balance between those two aspects. It's good that academia is resilient. It'll stand up to shifts in political climate, but it's also resistant. And those old-fashioned ways of thinking and toxic cultures, failure to build inclusive environments, costs everybody and diminishes research outputs. And these are just some examples from other countries. So in the US, some of you may have seen the report that came out last year in June 2018, that a very extensive report from the national academies, science, engineering, and medicine, that describes a culture of harassment in those disciplines. Harassment, gender-based harassment, second only to the military in terms of comparisons against industry and other sectors. And certainly in the UK, a lot of work by the academic sector and by things like the Royal Society of Chemistry, to really address culture and context towards building more inclusive environments. And so we can look to other countries for best practices, and really look to other countries for having very deep, very explicit conversations, uncomfortable conversations that I think we are reluctant to do in Canada. And so one of the things I do is go out there and push us to have those uncomfortable conversations. There's a bit of a myth in Canada that, you know, we don't have these problems. We certainly do have these problems in Canada, but we are very polite. We don't want to talk about them. And, you know, that avoidance of conflict, that avoidance of uncomfortable truths really is costing us, because the truth is it does go on. And I've picked on the University of Manitoba here just because the report came out, but there isn't a university or college in this country that doesn't have challenges with bullying, with inequitable work environments, with racism. And I collect stories. Every time I go and give a talk, somebody will come up to me afterwards or send me an email or send me a DM or whatever, and will tell me their story, or tell me what happened to them. And a lot of it is gender-based, but not exclusively. There is racism, there is homophobia, and there are real challenges around toxic cultures. And trainees are among the most vulnerable and the least able to challenge these systems or call them out. So this is why we have to address culture and context much more than trying to or maybe in addition to another mentoring program or another training program. So when the Liberal government came in 2015, it was a mandate, a clear mandate, an expectation of the Minister of Science at that time, Kirsty Duncan, to address this lack of full inclusion of inclusive design, of intentional work on culture and context. And so part of the mandate then was to really figure out how to create a better, stronger, more inclusive academic sector, and that meant looking to best practices from other countries. And it's an economic driver as well as a good practice. And we can look at ourselves, we can look and study ourselves, and we have scholarship, we have very, very outstanding scholarship in this country that points to where the problems lie and the realities. We have some data that describes how underrepresented some groups are. And so we can build on the information that we have. We are data poor in this country relative to other countries, but that's not to say that we can't do something about this. I recommend this book, The Equity Myth. Some of you may follow Melinda Smith, which is a brilliant scholar at the University of Alberta. Carl James was at York. I think he's in Ottawa now. Howard Ramus, I think he was in Ottawa, maybe he's in Dalhousie. This is a pan-Canadian piece of work that is a difficult read at times, but will really address and explain, you know, this myth that we have in this country that Canadian PSC is you know, equitable. So building on evidence and data from multiple sources, it's clear that, you know, all the workshops, mentoring programs that we're very good at in Canada, we're very good at mentoring programs to promote, retain underrepresented groups, for instance, women in STEM, will not change participation rates unless the culture of the workplace also changes. And that means those with power and privilege must take responsibility and be held accountable. And so this is really the foundation for programs like Athena Swan. It builds on that reality and it builds towards making actionable changes, measuring those changes, requiring inclusive leadership as a key performance indicator for everybody, whether you're a program director, a chair, a dean, a president. You have to incentivize. Human beings are, you know, they're animals. We can study ourselves. We work on the basis, we're motivated by incentives. There has to be accountability. If you don't do it, something happens and consequences, and we're all complicit. So we're all responsible. So we all are part of this change. It's not on women. It's not on people of color. It's not on people with disabilities to try harder. As I often say, we don't tell people who use mobility devices or wheelchairs to lean in to get up those steps. We take out the steps and we put in a ramp. So we identify the barriers and we remove them. That's on all of us to do that. It's not on the marginalized group to try harder. There's a little video here that I recommend to everybody. It's from a sociology professor, and I think it's University of Denver or University of Colorado. She's a sociologist, and she talks about how do you get humans to do things. And we think that people are motivated by doing good things. They want to incorporate EDI because it's the right thing to do, because it's morally just. And actually, people are not. Some people are motivated by those things, but many people aren't. And how do we get people to do things that we need them to do? Engage in healthy behaviors like, you know, use seatbelts, give up smoking. We have to both educate people and raise awareness, but we also have to provide incentives, and sometimes we have to legislate, and that's what we did with seatbelts, and we legislated around gay marriage. So sometimes we have to use a systems approach. So it's not just enough to tell people it's a good idea. You also have to incentivize. There are 3 things that she describes in this, and I should know her name because I should give her credit, but set behavioral expectations. Don't think that you'll change somebody's attitudes and then their behaviors will change afterwards. Set behavioral expectations first. So we're going to have a diverse speakers list. I don't care whether you believe in EDI or not, but that's the behavioral expectation. We will have a diverse speakers list. There will be a diverse conference organizing committee. There will be a diverse, you know, selection process, whatever it is. So set the behavioral expectations. Human beings are very heavily motivated by loss. What might you lose out on if you don't do this? And this has been quite effective in Canada in terms of the Canada Research Chairs, the Canada Excellence Research Chairs, funding. There's nothing that motivates universities and faculty members like money. So if you don't do what we need you to do, you might not get what you want. And then shifting social norms. If you think about how social norms have shifted significantly around, for example, gay marriage, what becomes normalized behavior in a department or a program then becomes it becomes harder for people to behave against that. So shifting social norms. So having an organization like CAPS fully engage in EDI as a normal kind of part of just the culture of the organization then becomes the social norm. And then people become familiar with the social norm. People want to be part of the social norm. So these are these are ways to actually shift behaviors towards what we want to achieve. And they can be done at a whole bunch of different sort of systems levels, on the individual basis or on an institutional basis. So the Athena Swan type of approach is really looking at evidence-based policy changes that can address systemic barriers, organizational, structural, across the whole organization. It's very data dependent, quantitative data and qualitative data being really important, which is why having social scientists involved is critically important. We look at how these kinds of programs are run in other countries, and then there are characteristics that really are required, particularly courage and leadership. This little awareness to education, to actions, to outcomes is a really good kind of mantra to follow in all of these kinds of initiatives. We're kind of good about the awareness, but we often jump straight to actions without really learning about what works or not, which is why we continually hear about, well, we need to get more girls interested in STEM. Yes, we know there's a problem, and then we jump straight to an action for which there's really very little evidence to support effective change in the absence of a systems approach. There's nothing wrong with getting girls into STEM, but in the absence of looking at culture and context, it won't make a difference. And we've seen that from the data over the last 20 or 30 years. So awareness to education, what works, what actually has an impact, and then turn that into an actionable program and then measure it to see what the outcomes are. And so this has been a way to sort of start to drive the universities towards actually shifting, or at least taking account of their culture. By the end of 2018, all the universities was required to have an equity plan as part of the CRC cert nomination process. Whatever university you're at, find that equity plan, print it out and keep a copy of it, because you may be in a situation where you want to refer to that if you're trying to achieve a particular initiative, get a little conference going, or maybe you're not being treated fairly. Take a look at what your university has committed to. They've put it down in writing, so keep them accountable to it. Organizational cultural change requires accountability, and keeping the universities accountable because they put it in writing is actually a huge step forward. You can hold them accountable, and I've seen a couple of places where this has actually been quite helpful when a university has said, no, we're not going to run a grant workshop just for women because that would be discriminatory. You can point to a particular section in their equity plan where it says, we will run workshops for underrepresented groups. So you said you'd do it in the plan, now you're telling me you won't, I'm going to hold you accountable against your plan. The organizational cultural change then is the Dimensions program, which is a sort of an overarching approach to having a look at the culture in your particular institution. And it builds on programs that have been running around the world now for a number of years. So the advanced program in the US was perhaps one of the first to really try to look at how to shift organizational culture. It was a funding program funded by the NSF. It was individualized. Universities would apply to get money to do research, and then try to implement the findings of that research. So it was patchy. Often the research was done and then nothing happened to the research after that. Athena Swan is an accreditation program. There's no money associated with it, but it's a prestige kind of issue. It's like LEED certification for buildings. So everybody starts off at a lower level. As you acquire more stature and more skills and more proven record in the field, you can move up the accreditation towards a gold Athena Swan Award. It's sector-wide, it's institutionally competitive, there's a shared responsibility, but initially the first iterations were overly bureaucratic. It was unidimensional, it was gender binary, it was limited to science. It's now extended across all disciplines and across all intersectionalities. However, it's still quite bureaucratic. And I've sat on one of the peer review processes in the UK to see how the process actually works. And it's very interesting. It's very interesting to have universities take a long, hard look at themselves and see where they can make improvements in terms of EDI. Australia adopted the Athena Swan model. It's called SAGE. It was run as a pilot. They're just coming through the pilot now, SAGE pilot. Again, accreditation. Every institution in Australia immediately signed on to the charter. Everybody wanted to be part of the process. Everybody wanted to get with the program because it made them look good. And that was a bit of a problem because it had to ramp up so quickly. It was difficult to have the sufficient capacity for the peer review for all of the organizations, institutions that wanted to participate. It was also gender binary. They had an Indigenous component, and how are we going to integrate Aboriginal scholars? How are we going to improve the culture for Aboriginal scholars? And that was done as a bit of an afterthought, and it was poorly managed in terms of how they structured the actual application process. So there's a real lesson learned there that we can also look to in Canada and say, we're going to do it that way, we're going to do it our way. The US has adopted the Athena Swan model. They call it C-Change. It's administered out of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's also an accreditation. It's about adopting best practices. They've gone across all disciplines, across all kinds of human characteristics. So they've gone across all genders, all backgrounds. Are you a first generation university attendee, across all parts of the university community? They have socioeconomic barriers, all of these kinds of things. The US has massive amounts of data on their university communities. They have so much data, it's really hard to know where to focus. And I'm on the international advisory board for that particular C-Change program. So it's very interesting to see how that one's rolling out. They've given out their first awards, and so there's some lessons learned there. So in Canada, taking together all of that information about how other people are doing it, we have what I think could be, depending on how it rolls out, could be a best in world program, and it's called Dimensions, and it will go across disciplines, and as it says at the bottom here, addresses obstacles faced by, but not limited to, the 4 designated groups under labor law at the federal level. So the 4 underrepresented designated groups, that being women, Indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, and members of visible minority racialized groups, plus members of the LGBTQ2+, communities. So it's going across disciplines, across human characteristics, and is building on the data that we have. And it is still an accreditation model. So this, I think, has the potential to be best in world, but we will see how it rolls out and how it's managed. The process is one where the institutions who are seeking to be accredited undergo what's really a self-reflection. They have to do a full self-reflection of the state of the institution. There is a self-assessment team that is formed. It collects data, an environmental scan, climate survey, actual numbers of who's doing what and where. That self-assessment team collects those data, analyzes the data, identifies gaps, issues, does a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis, and out of that develops an action plan. Now, nobody can fix anything in 2 or 3 years, but there may be areas where an institution could say, wow, we really have not seen a change in our recruiting to computer science for women and underrepresented groups. We're going to have a targeted specific hiring plan that's going to address that particular issue. Or it could be our senior executive team has been all white men for the last 30 years. We're going to really address and look at how we are recruiting people and what we're going to, what we're going to do about it. They then have to implement the action plan. It could be looking at policies and processes. It could be updating parental leave. It could be, for instance, looking at postdoctoral support systems, often a place where there are gaps and weaknesses. And it needs to, an institution will put those into place and then measure progress towards those goals. That process is then submitted for peer review, and it'll be going through NSERC. And then will be evaluated and will be either awarded or not awarded a bronze award as the first level. And then the process is to reflect and repeat. So universities are not competing against each other, which is really, really important. Universities were terrified that they were going to be competing against each other. Universities and colleges are going to be competing against themselves. Am I better than I was 5 years ago? How much better can I be 5 years from now? So that's a really important thing to notice. If you take a look at the leaders, for instance, in the UK, and there are two here that that are just outstanding: Imperial College London and University of York in the UK, both of whom are among the few Athena Swan Gold Medal Award winners. And interestingly, both of these institutions had very engaged white male leaders, both of the male leaders for EDI integration were leaders academically, they were leaders in the institution, they were leaders in the disciplinary sense, both chemists, and very effective in getting progress made on these initiatives. This is Tom Welton, who's now the president of the Royal Society of Chemistry in the UK, proudly gay as well. So a real understanding of what it means to be a member of a group that is discriminated against, but real leaders in terms of affecting change. And if you look at their websites, it always makes me cry a little bit when I look at the websites of these places. I mean, if you look at them, you think, why? Who wouldn't want to work in these places? Because they just create such a sense of welcoming and humanity and recognition for the whole person. So this is what we're trying to get towards. This is Sage Pilot in the US. They also have other organizations that I've been pushing. Canada could do something along the lines of Male Champions for Change, which is where the leaders with power and privilege step up and actually commit to, in this case, gender equity. And if Australia could do this, honestly, I don't know why Canada can't do this. And then in the US, it's Sea Change, and it's more so focused on STEM, but again, looking for institutional transformation. What's a postdoc to do? So that was information about some of the Athena Swan-like stuff that's going on in Canada, but what's a postdoc to do? And I really want to highlight a couple of things that I think are really important for postdocs. And that is that these issues are becoming core elements of skill sets that employers are looking for. So for instance, we just posted at Ryerson this tenure track position in, it's in chemistry, and this is part of the job ad. So if you are seeking a job in academia, particularly from, let's say, most of the universities outside of the U15, but including some of the U15 universities, Waterloo is quite progressive around EDI. You need to know what EDI means, and you need to know how it relates to, for instance, service teaching and scholarly research. How will you create an inclusive classroom? How will you develop a research program that truly recruits from all parts of humanity? So it becomes a skill set that you need to learn. If your program or your institution is not providing you with training in that skill set, go and get it, because I can tell you, as a hiring dean and now sitting on search committees, there are lots of people out there who are really very, very thoughtful and knowledgeable in these areas. It's a core competency, so it's a skill set. Competency is some people using the word core fluency, because core competency suggests that if you don't have it, you're incompetent. Are you fluent in these skills, the effective application, integration into the workplace? And in addition to that, do you know about sex and gender-based analysis? So if you are particularly in the life sciences, or you're in the qualitative research like psychology or other aspects, other kinds of research, do you know how sex and gender-based analysis impacts or is important in experimental design? And this is not just academia. As I said, industry and business are kind of a little bit ahead of academia. So these are also skill sets you can take into other sectors. Gender-based analysis as a policy issue is really important in governance. And so these are skills that really everybody's looking for. Academia, if you're looking for a grant, and remember I said humans are motivated by what they might not get. So universities, if you don't have sex and gender-based analysis incorporated into your research at CIHR, NSERC, or SHRC, you might not get the money. It's mandatory. And EDI integration for high quality personnel in NSERC grants is mandatory. And that's 30% of your assessment. CIHR has very good resources. They've done a good job of explaining sex and gender-based analysis. I recommend looking at their resources. They're very good. They've got very good training modules, and you can just go read them. They're very well done. I encourage everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, male, female, whatever gender you are, whatever your discipline. They're good resources to be familiar with. And I show this to researchers because this is what an NSERC review sheet looks like if you are reviewing grants. So I sit on NSERC, I'm a co-chair of an evaluation group. Have you considered sex, gender, and diversity in your research design? That's now mandatory. If you haven't done that, you're going to score lower. And in your section on HQP, have you talked about how you build an inclusive research environment? Have you talked about respecting all of the characteristics that all of the people can bring? Are you just looking at very narrow sets of metrics about how you recruit or how you support people? That's mandatory, and if you don't have that, then you may score lower. And this is from CIHR. I also sit on the CIHR panel. Are you able to explain gender as a socio-cultural factor, and have you taken it into account in your research design? And if you're not getting training in these things, then I encourage you to seek those out. And if you are getting training, good, because it's just something that you should be getting. I can't tell you how many grants I've read where somebody will say, we're doing cell culture, so we don't have to worry about sex and gender-based analysis. And it's really quite worrying, because if you're doing cell culture, your cells have sex. They have a sex, and you should know what it is. They probably also have HeLa cells are of a woman of color. So there's a characteristic to those cells. It's experimental design. It's about good science. It's about good experimental design. I would also say for postdocs, because I've seen and heard too many really difficult situations, I would say you must know your rights. Know your rights under labor law, know your institutional policy. And postdoctoral rights vary enormously across the country and by institution. So our postdocs at my institution are considered employees. They are eligible for all the employee benefits. They are an employee category. Regardless of where the funding comes from, they're employees. They're much more secure than they are at other places. And so know your institutional rights, know what's available to you under federal policy, tri-council policies. The tri-councils are doing a better job in some ways than some of the institutions are doing. And know your disciplinary societies, policies, and procedures. Other things that you can do are to learn more about the vocabulary of EDI, understand intersectionalities, understand white privilege. If you're a white woman, stand up against racism and anti-Semitism. It's not just about gender. And learn how to call it out, bystander training, allyships. If they're not happening, ask for them. Demand better, ask for accountability. What are the institutional policies? Codes of conduct are really easy. Everybody should have a code of conduct for their conference. There are enough uncomfortable incidents and sometimes bordering on criminal incidents that happen at conferences, including in Canada, to suggest that if you don't have a code of conduct, you could be liable, a society could be liable, that kind of thing. And celebrate all of the aspects of humanity that come to the research culture. And I've just given some examples here. Soapbox Science is a program I brought to Canada, where women can speak to their science in the public, not doing the outreach, but actually talking about their science, being seen as scientists. This is Ada Lovelace Day, International Women in Engineering Day, LGBT STEM Day. And there was University of Windsor, to its credit, just had the first in Canada LGBTQ in STEM conference that just happened. And this is an email I received from a young colleague at the University of Toronto who I recommended to go speak on a panel, who is a young man who lived much of his life, he's in his 20s, in the closet, and it took an enormous toll on his life, obviously, and his ability to contribute in his research setting. Eventually came out to his research colleagues, and huge, huge support. I was on a panel with him at another conference. I suggested that he go speak at this conference, and he came back and he said, he sent me this email. I've never felt more at home in a room full of strangers, to be honest, because everybody at that conference could relate. He was amongst people who had very familiar experiences. And I don't want to be getting those emails in the future. I want every environment for every young person, every trainee, every postdoc to be a place where they feel at home, because they are at home, they can bring their full selves to work. They can bring their full selves to their research institution and be themselves without having to worry what other people think. Community, copycats, champions, all of these things are important, and all of these things are something that everybody can do. If you have privilege, step up and speak up, particularly men, white women. There are lots of resources. This is from Catalyst. You don't know what to say. Here are some things. Here's some ideas, what you can say in response to what people say. You know, if somebody says, suck it up and be a man, what to do instead, show empathy. Lots of resources available. And just finally, EDI work is hard work. When you're accustomed to privilege, equity or equality feels like oppression. So there are lots of people who will push back, organizations and institutions will push back against change. This is to be expected. Don't think that everybody is going to get on board with this because people feel threatened. So you have to be strategic about what you can do and how you can be involved if you want to affect change. But everybody can contribute to cultural, contextual change. The other thing is that this work is uncomfortable. Talking about differences, challenging people, calling people out on sexist jokes, calling people out on racist language is uncomfortable. And we have to deal with discomfort. We're not very good in Canada at dealing with discomfort. We don't like to make people feel uncomfortable. We're very polite, but that's kind of almost passive aggressive as well. So we have to embrace discomfort. And Sarah Kaplan, Institute for Gender and the Economy, has done some great work around why discomfort is actually a good driving force. It leads to more innovation. If you have, and people may have experienced this, if you've got people who come from a whole bunch of different countries and they speak different languages, when they have to present ideas, you have to work harder, you have to clarify concepts more thoroughly. So you actually get better outputs, you get better results, but it takes practice, and it is hard and it takes practice, but it is worth it. So don't expect everybody to be all you know, rainbows and dolphins and unicorns. This is hard work and there will be pushback, which is why doing what you can do in the way that you can do it for your environment is really important. And people like me who have privilege, tons and tons of privilege and tons of security because I have tenure, I have much more of a burden of responsibility to be doing more of it and getting out there and saying things that maybe make people feel uncomfortable. So finally, more resources here if you're looking for staff, or I have a consulting company also which has probably more up-to-date resources now. And finally, be brave, not perfect. And together we will create a stronger sort of science culture, a stronger academic culture in Canada. Thank you. Okay, so.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. We have a few minutes to take questions from the floor. Yes.
Actually, if somebody else has a question, I feel like I'm probably okay. I'm gonna run. So I know when we were reviewing the Swan Charter earlier this year, there was a very nice charter that sort of laid out principles that enable the implementation of the vision. But you know, the devil's in the details, how the specifics get implemented or up to the institutions. And it's also, as Imogen mentioned earlier, self-belief. So one of our concerns was, you know, how effective is this going to really be? you know, and is there a danger of EDI washing? And is there any oversight to kind of prevent that?
Were you able to hear that, or do you want me to repeat the question?
So I think I got most of it. So the charter outlines the principles. And so, as you said, the devil's in the details, and will it be D&I washing? Is that what you said?
Yeah, EDI washing.
EDI washing. Yeah, I think that's a real concern, a very valid concern, a concern that a lot of people have raised, because we're very good at talking about what we want to do and not very good at actually implementing change. I think it will depend on how the program is managed. I have concerns about that, but I can tell you from my involvement in the process in the UK and in Australia and the US, that as long as the peer review is rigorous, there will be no capacity for EDI washing, because it will be peer reviewed by experts who will take a look and say, this is, you know, this is insufficient. So I think the peer review, we consider peer review to be the kind of gold standard, right? That keeps the quality of whatever exercise that we're involved in. It keeps the quality up there. If an institution comes in and says we have very little of concern, but we're going to address this one thing over here, and then 3 years later, yes, we've seen an increase of 10%, and they've sort of fudged the numbers to make it look like it's proportional, and there's lots of different ways you can play with data. As long as the peer review panel is knowledgeable and rigorous, they will not get away with that. So that's the key. I'll tell you also that there is pushback from Universities Canada, and there's pushback from U15 and other institutions, because they don't want to be held accountable, and because this will cost resources. And so it's going to be a continual effort to maintain the accountability, to ensure that the process and the way the applications come in is rigorous. The applications have to be fulsome, they have to have solid data, and they have to have action plans that show evidence of change. And then the review it's not a rubber stamp. There are institutions that are not awarded. I saw that in London. There are also institutions that are awarded and then come back three years later, as you must, who then lose their accreditation. So I think the key is to keep that piece really, really strong and rigorous. And that's the same for the whole peer review culture that we have. So we'll see how it goes. But if we have good peer reviewers, we can be hopeful.
And I know that you said that the universities don't want to compete against each other, but I was just wondering if they're in any way obliged to share their data or their outcomes publicly.
So another very good question. The pilot institutions were announced in August. There are 17 pilot institutions. There were some institutions that weren't included in the pilot, who were very upset about that. And that will motivate them to make some changes, I think. So the institutions that have been selected to be the pilot are beginning to talk to each other, and have been encouraged by the Tri-Councils to share their letters of intent, to share their process. There is a reluctance amongst the universities to do that. So we will see if that culture will begin to change, and if universities will start to become more engaged in sharing best practices and learning from one another. So I think we'll see. There's certainly some universities that are very, very resistant to sharing any information. But I think as accreditation starts to happen, other universities will be motivated to want to get, to get that kind of gold star. And we'll start to see perhaps more collaboration going on. So it's very interesting, and this has been documented in the UK. It's very interesting to see how the culture of inter-university sort of collaboration and inter-university competition began to shift once the accreditation started to go out, because other universities that had been assuming their superiority were not getting the accreditation, and then they were seeking out, perhaps in a slightly more egalitarian way, a way to work with sort of so-called lesser universities that were getting accreditation, and started to see some real shifts in culture there. So we'll see what happens in Canada. There's a resistance, but if the system is held to account and kept rigorous, we might see collaboration going on more effectively.
How do you prevent against the sort of lack of diversity within the EDI sort of universe? I don't know if I'm starting this question off right, but for example, you might have an institution or a department of people that want to implement EDI, and they might have a world-class plan for gender diversity, but they've completely ignored racialized people. And so on one hand, it's world class, and on the other hand, it's completely invisible. And you know, is that an example of something that's successful, or is that an example of something that's failed? And how would you advise institutions to sort of I don't know, is that something that's encouraged or discouraged? You know, because on one hand it's great, on the other hand it's not. So it's sort of, it's just, I guess it's one of these challenges when you're embarking on an EDI adventure, I guess. But do you have any reaction to that?
Yeah, so I would say that if you have, you know, if you have what you describe as a world-class plan for gender diversity, it doesn't include racialized minorities. It's not a world-class plan. It's a completely inadequate plan, because a woman of color experiences bias and prejudice on the basis of her color before her gender, and so you cannot differentiate those aspects. And that's, you know, a world-class plan on EDI acknowledges the diversity of humanity, and that will be by gender, by ethnicity, by sexual orientation, by socioeconomic class, all of those kinds of things. So that is an overarching principle. It may be that there is a particular action that you want to pursue that relates to, you know, gender, generally gender in general, but it has to be framed within an acknowledgement that gender is only one of many aspects of you know, humanity. So you know, that this is why any plan must be really reflective of the division, the program, the institution, the, you know, the research group, to address what is it that is actionable for that particular division or that particular group. And it, you know, maybe ethnicity, maybe you do have, you know, really strong ethnicity, but, you know, you don't have great gender diversity, but every action comes under an overarching principle that a world-class plan will address all of those issues, but that an actionable program or set of actions may focus more specifically on one particular aspect. I think that the problem is, and I don't know what your discipline is, but, you know, my problem is in sciences, there's been a huge emphasis on women in science. And really what that has meant is white women in science, white girls in science, white women in science, without understanding that if you don't tackle racism, you can't deal with sexism. So these things are all connected. And you have to have an EDI lens that sees how all of these things are connected when you go into developing your action plan.
Other questions from the floor? Okay, so we'll hopefully be continuing this conversation with you and with institutions on bringing EDI into our practice as postdocs. Mm-hmm. So thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So we have got more coffee and more food, but then we know what to do with. So please, everybody, eat as much as you can. Get some coffee. I think we were a little bit late starting, so what time are we supposed to finish?
2:30.
2:30. So let's go to 2:40, and we'll meet back and we'll start our next workshop.
I applied for a job at Ryerson, and I saw that blurb that she posted, and I wrote about this particular panel as one of my EDI initiatives.
That's great. Oh, good.
I would love to hear
I
her.
would love to ask her like more
Yeah,
questions. I wish she was in the room.
Yeah.
Okay, she was.